And again, I would like to, Elise Fry is not on this. She is playing emergency backup for us for technology purposes. Well, Elise, I'll let you know as you are taking on some of this technology burden for us. Go ahead and let you introduce yourself really quickly.
My name is Elise Fry. I am the Test Administration and Formative Assessment Specialist with USBE. I recognize many of you as I do trainings as well, just more on the administration side instead of the content side.
And Teresa.
I'm Teresa McIntyre. I'm the Assessment Development Coordinator. I just recently transitioned to that. So previously I was the Elementary Language Arts Assessment Specialist, and my computer is being glitchy, so I'm going to be turning off my camera in hopes that everything else works the way it's supposed to.
All right. And then I am Megan Lopez. I am the secondary English Language Arts Assessment Specialist. So I oversee the development of our RISE reading and writing assessment for grades 6, 7, and 8. And then I also oversee the development for our Utah Aspire Plus grades 9 and 10. Now just reading assessment. Um, and I also oversee the test administration for our state's WIDA assessments, and that's for grades K through 12. And then I am also one of the program managers for our state's legislated assessment to achievement program. So, with that, moving on, we do have some learning intentions and success criteria for today. And so really the purpose of this training, as we all come together, is hopefully for all of our participants to gain a thorough understanding of all the changes that are taking place to the RISE ELA assessment and the Utah Aspire Plus assessments. We hope that all the participants will understand the steps in the RISE ELA timeline, um, and identified the differences with the RISE and UA Plus assessments that you will be seeing this year in the spring test administration. We want you to have a thorough understanding of the new ELA blueprints for both of those assessments. Um, we will dive into the difference between clusters and traditional items for our RISE assessment and how to actually access those training tests to practice with those. Um, and again, make sure that we all have a shared understanding of the revised ELA standards and then resources that can help support our ELA teachers. So core guides and performance level descriptors. So those are our overarching goals for today. And again, as we have people still joining today with us, please do note that this is being recorded. It will be posted on a public USB YouTube page. And again, we would invite anyone to put any questions in the chat at any time or go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll invite you to come off mute to ask your questions. We encourage all the participation possible. We will be putting you into breakout rooms to have discussions. We apologize that a lot of this information will be us just feeding you information since we do have a limited amount of time. We want to get the information to the masses. So you, again, have the link to the slides. We invite you to share those with your colleagues and also utilize them as you best see fit. All right, turning it over to Teresa.
Yeah. So we just wanted to start with a overview of what we have associated with our RISE assessment. So we do have benchmarks. These are optional benchmarks. Currently, our ELA benchmarks are available. We're going to be releasing writing benchmarks as well as some reading cluster benchmarks on February 18th. So those will be available on the 18th. They are optional, but they are a great resource. They are aligned to our standards. They are mimic the same item types that you're going to see on the RISE assessment. And they're not throwaway items. They're just items that we have used and retired because they just had been used so many times. We also have our interims. We do not have an interim this year because we don't have cut scores yet that are determining what those different levels are. But this will be available in the 2025-26 school year. We only have it for reading. We don't have writing interims. And we do have the summative, and this is our required end of the year assessment. So we have our reading test for grades 3 through 8, and then writing only in grades 5 and 8. So our benchmark assessments are available for every single grade. And the differences that you're going to see if you go in and look at those writing benchmarks, you won't see any editing language benchmarks or speaking or listening. Those have both been retired based on the changes within our standards. And then you will notice that the writing benchmark language for the prompts itself and the rubrics are both different. The writing benchmarks are available February 18th. So both the writing benchmarks, and then we will also have reading cluster benchmarks that will be available on the 18th. And we will be talking more about what those clusters benchmarks look like.
We know this. Can we pause really quickly and go back to this? One question about the benchmarks that we have gotten quite frequently from educators is this idea that they are optional. So from the state perspective, at the state level, benchmarks are optional. These are not required per state law. The only assessments that are required by state law are the summative assessment, okay, and then writing in grades 5 and 8. That is how our current law is written. Benchmarks are optional. There are some LEAs, whether it's a school district or a charter, that do require benchmarks. So if there is any confusion saying, I thought benchmarks were required, that might be an LEA policy. So you should double check with your LEA if benchmarks are required per your own local policy. Benchmarks are going to be scored when you do the benchmarks. You do get a score, but they do not come on a scale. They're just a raw score. So if there's, if the items are worth 10 points, it's just going to be out of 10 points.
That's for our reading benchmarks. If your question was about the writing benchmarks, the answer is this year, there will not be any automatic scoring for our writing benchmarks. So I know this is the reading training, but we're really putting a plug in for our writing benchmarks. We need 5,000 students per essay to participate in order to have enough essays to train our scoring engine. So we still need more students to sign to participate in order to meet those requirements. So we do know that that's a sacrifice because the writing benchmarks will not provide any automatic scoring and you will not be able to see the students writing. But it's the sacrifice this year for all future years to be able to have those writing benchmarks available for utilization in grades 3 through 8.
And Teresa, I got a question in the chat. It is about the writing benchmarks. And yes, the purposes for today is to really focus on the ELA portion. We did do a writing training last Friday that is available online. But if you want, again, if you want benchmarks, writing benchmarks next year, we got to get enough students responding in those samples to be able to validate our new writing benchmarks. So if you have teachers or you are a teacher and you want to participate, you do not have to do any of the scoring if you participate in this. We just need student responses. Teachers or LEAs can fill out the survey that I just linked in the chat. So the survey does appear more geared towards an entire district or charter, so an LEA, but individual teachers can participate in the writing benchmark field test. So we, want as many people. So individuals or whole districts, please sign up because we've already developed everything. It would be a horrible waste of money if we don't continue to have these and make them available. And if you have completed the survey already and you still haven't heard anything back, we are still making sure we have enough participants to move forward with the field test.
Yeah. We're
been answering all the
we're
questions.
Yeah, we're checking that and really hoping we get enough participants. I will add where the benchmark for writing will be open from February 18th through June 6th. So if you're like, I don't really have time now, but you could do it after your summative testing at the end of the year and have students go in and write a benchmark when there's a little more time, that we are leaving it open for that. No, the survey is not required. That's just for our purposes in order to see if we're going to have enough people, if we need to start going out and begging, and then also for us to just provide more additional information about the writing benchmarks.
Let's be honest, we've been begging though. We need as much help as we can get. This
We
is us
have.
pleading and begging. We don't want your good taxpayer monies wasted, and we want this to be an available tool for all Utah educators.
Yes. Yeah, and just as for a frame of reference, we have 4 essays for third, fourth, and sixth and seventh. So we need, 20,000 responses, 20,000 students to take the essays. And in eighth grade and fifth grade, we have 6 responses. So we need 30,000 students to take those writing benchmarks in order to have enough to train our scoring engine. So if you're like, well, we're just small, well, every little bit helps make that difference. And the most students can take is 2. So they can take 1 argumentative and 1 informative benchmark. So then our summative assessment, this is the assessment that is required at the end of the school year for all grades 3 through 8. And when we look at what's changed, the assessment is it's just based on the reading standards. We no longer have editing language. We no longer have speaking and listening. It's just our reading standards. We have added clusters to every single assessment, and every student will see at least 1 informative or literary passage. And Megan will talk more about those clusters. So for this year, there will not be automatic scoring. Students will not automatically see a response when they finish, and you will not get automatic scores for those students either. We do have to undergo a standard setting, which is where we bring in teachers and we really evaluate where's going to be those cut points for a 1, 2, 3, or 4 on our assessment. That's going to happen in the summer, and then scores will be released fall 2025. Selena, Megan's going to go through and explain exactly what a cluster item looks like, because it is new and every student is going to see one. So we want to make sure everyone understands what that looks like and how to help their students be prepared. So just an overall timeline, we have our operational field test. So that's this spring. We'll do some item development meetings. We'll look at the data, make sure everything is looking good. We'll do our standard setting, which will be in August. And then we get cut scores and we submit those to the board. And then the following spring, 2026, those scores will be automatic. The ELA benchmarks will be scored, though we have not changed those other than aligning them to the new standards. The cluster benchmarks that are being added in the middle of February will also be scored. It's just the writing benchmarks, because we have to take all of that writing data. We'll have a group of educators that will go through and make determinations on the scoring for those and what it looks like to have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paper. Then we have to go through and train the scoring engine on how to do that automatic scoring. So it just takes time for those writing benchmarks because they are brand new. Okay. When we look at the blueprints, these are available on the RISE portal under the resources. And each student is going to receive 3 reading passages with associated items. There'll be no automatic scoring for writing or reading. The 6 through 8 blueprint looks almost exactly the same. It's just the informational item range is a little higher because the expectation is that in 6th through 8th grade, they receive more informational text than literary text. But otherwise, it's exactly the same. 3 passages with traditional items like you are used to seeing, and then 1 cluster.
And that is also due to the nature of the standards in the upper grades where we see that that standard, I believe now it's off the top of my head and I'm afraid I'm going to misspeak, standard 13 only having that informative strand. All right, I think we are ready to move on to clusters, which has been asked about in the chat. So clusters for students that and educators that have seen the 4th grade on up science test, they are used to a cluster design. Now, when you see clusters in math and ELA, it's going to be obviously a little different because the subject matter is different. But for most students that have been engaging in RISE already, that have been in 4th grade on up, they are probably a little more used to a cluster design and test taking experience. For your 3rd grade students or students that have never experienced clusters at all, and actually just best test preparation practices, we highly encourage that you get students into the training tests so they understand the platform and how to interact with clusters in any of the 3 content areas. So we're going to be taking a little bit of time to walk you through what the clusters are on the RISE assessment, as all students will be exposed to them. We do have training tests that we will give you time to interact with. These cluster training tests have been available since last year. So for some of you, you may have actually already seen these. But you know, if you haven't, we really want to make sure that everyone is familiar with what they will see. About a quarter of students saw clusters last year in the field test, but all students will have a cluster this year, no matter what, as operational. So, what are clusters? A cluster is a multi-part item. So on the RISE test, we're going to have our stimulus on one side, and then we're going to have the questions on the other side of the screen. So we got our passage, that's the stimulus, and then all the questions. A cluster is going to be not stand-alone questions where I'm going to answer this and I'm going to click next and move to the next question, but instead, the questions are all unified onto one page. So it is going to require scrolling by the students. So if students are not used to scrolling, or if you have just trackpads, make sure that the students are used to interacting with that scrolling element in the testing platform. And since all the items, all the questions are going to come one after the other, all in one as a unified task. That means that all the questions are somehow going to be related to each other. We believe that clusters are designed to mirror more what is authentically happening in classrooms. And it allows us to explore different paths of interpretation of what we read. So, quite often, when we have our traditional test, we have the passage, and then we might have a question that says, what is the theme of the passage? And they're going to have a multiple choice question and four choices, of which only one of those themes is going to be the correct option. But guess what? There are passages that might have multiple themes. And so we want students to be able to explore the different themes. So a student A might choose one theme, where student B might choose another theme. And then the questions that follow will be supporting that theme. So it's a much more of a choose your own adventure style of testing. Or, a lot of times with these standalone questions, we say, here's this character, we're going to ask a question about analyzing this character. Whereas in a cluster, we can say, you know what? I'm going to choose the character that I want to analyze. And then I'm going to provide evidence and support, in the following questions, right? So it allows a little more, again, choosing your own adventure and how you want to analyze and interpret the passage that you are given. So again, it's not just, well, this is the right theme because this is what we're saying is the right theme. It's more open-ended in that students can really explore the myriad of possibilities that come along with reading and analyzing with what you're truly reading. So clusters are built normally around a primary standard, and that primary standard normally will end up being the culminating task, right? You will see at the beginning of the passage a task statement as well. So, and this gives the students a little more direction in what they're reading. So before you even read it, you're being told, this is really what we want you to focus your reading on, right? And that again is really what we believe is taking place in the classroom with your good instruction. So, we would like to show you examples of these. So we'll move on to the next one so you know how to access these training clusters, and then we're going to show them to you and give you time in breakout rooms to explore these. So next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to go through one. Now, the way to get to these, I believe I'm going to walk you through. So I'm going to actually steal the screen. Um, and is everyone seeing my screen? Yes, I'm seeing thumbs ups. Thank you. Okay. When you go to the Rise portal, and I will ask my amazing colleagues, Elise or Teresa, to drop the link to our Rise portal in the chat. So you will go to the Rise portal, and mine is, and then on the right, from there, and sorry, mine is, I'm gonna go back to the main page. My screen is not refreshing, so this is really fun. I might have to, oh, here we go. There we go. It needs some really good think time on a Friday afternoon, y'all. Thanks for your patience with my computer. You're going to click here onto training tests. And then again, you will click on training test here. It should pop you into another screen. Now, this is the really fun part. This is also going to show you new enhancements. Everything does need to be read, as that helps us with our standardized testing procedures. So I'm not going to do this as it is time consuming. You can just go in as a guest user. You also do in practice sessions. You can, as a test administrator, actually open a practice test session and actually have students practice logging in. But again, for today's sake, we're just going to log in as guests, make it easier, and you're going to go through the whole gambit. And once you get there, right, You're going to choose the grade that you would like to focus on. I'll be honest, I went straight into the lower grades, the 3 through 5, um, because the cluster is the very first item on that training test. If you decide to go to the 6 through 8, you do have to go through good old Jim Bridger passage set first and click on through that to get to the training test cluster. Um, for the upper grades. So, like I said, I went to elementary because it was easier. So, again, you will see, and again, all the tools available. I'm going to expand this so you can see that we have our task statement at the top. So this one says in the questions that follow, compare and contrast the information about the history of the teddy bear. So again, this is going to really help the students focus their reading on comparing and contrasting the history of this topic, right? So now all of a sudden, it's going to be easier for me to really pay attention to certain details in my reading, okay? Please do just remember a word of caution. All the training tests, these are not meant for content necessarily. We are not guaranteeing that every single item is exactly aligned to a standard. The purpose of the training tests is so students and teachers can become familiar with the platform, and the item types. So sometimes we have to just show an item type, and it might not be the most directly aligned to our standards or a great example of content. But again, we want students to see every type of interaction they could encounter on our tests, and how do I get used to actually answering these item types. But again, very, very similar in content. It's just going to be a little better content and way more valid and reliable questions. Um, so again, we have a task statement, and then you'll have the entire passage. Sometimes a cluster will have just one passage. Sometimes it'll have two. And clusters can be, again, informative, or it can be literary. So then we will have our items, and I'm going to expand this way. And again, you're going to see that you can scroll through. Most of the clusters are going to be about 5 or 6, the most about 7 different interactions or parts. Okay. And again, it is some choose your own adventure. Um, so the first question is always going to be that entry point, right? And not all of them are going to be choose your own adventure. In this one, what is the main idea? Okay. But where you see who helped make the teddy bear popular in the United States, choose one. This one, when it just says choose one, this is where you're going to have your choose your own adventure. You can't get this wrong if you choose just one of them, right? So I'm going to say Teddy Roosevelt. And then how they choose here, this choose your own adventure, is going to determine how they answer the next portion. Okay. So I need to answer this next question based on my choice of Teddy Roosevelt. And then after that, then I'm going to select support from passage 1 for this. So this was my choose my own adventure. Everything that I do for the rest of this interaction is based on Teddy Roosevelt. Okay. And so I would then choose a piece of evidence that shows support for how I answered this question. Now, again, starting into the next passage, again, what's the main idea, right? And then I'm going to have, again, that same select text from over here for um, different main ideas from that passage. Okay. So again, you might see drop down menus in the clusters in different ways. This one's going to be a drop down menu for a timeline. You're going to see sometimes multiple choice, multi-select, table matches. So this should really show you the different types of interactions and how it will work. Um, so what we wanted you to do, and I'll have Teresa go ahead and start sharing again. Okay, and I got a question in the chat. Just to clarify, students can select topics they like. They don't get to choose the topic of the cluster. That is going to be assigned. Um, but they get to choose, such in that example that I just showed you, they get to choose which character they wanted to analyze. So, what we would like you to do is we're going to have you go into breakout rooms, and go ahead and access those clusters. And we would love for you to discuss in your breakout rooms what is going to be the best way to prepare your students for clusters, and how could you use something similar in your own classroom instruction, or in your formative, or your own long-term summative practices in your classroom. How can you use your classroom and instruction to help support students in this? So we had a comment in the chat saying, maybe it's just me, but this seems very overwhelming for a third grader, right? So in our breakout rooms, we would love for you to discuss, okay, if third graders are going to have to tackle something like this, again, how is it going to be best to support those students? And again, please just remember the training tests, not content. When you click on the training tests, whether it's for third grade, fourth grade, or fifth grade, you're going to see the same one. I am willing to say, and Teresa can confirm this, that that passage is probably geared more towards the higher grades, and a third grader is not going to see um, that something like that as a cluster, right?
Well, what I will add is that there's two comments I will make as far as, especially for third grade students. One is that you will never see when you do that text select where it then highlights the passage, you will never see the entire passage selected in third grade. When we met with our third grade teachers, they were like, that's way too overwhelming. And so we cut it down to a lot more like a much smaller selection of text when they have that interactive item where they're highlighting, where the text is highlighted and they're selecting a sentence to support their evidence. The second thing is that we did do a review of these clusters with actual students where we had them go through one-on-one and go through all of the steps. We worked with students who, it was in September, so they were fourth grade students, but they had just finished third grade. So they were basically third graders. And they didn't have a problem with it. In fact, one of the students was like, I really like this. I think my second grade sister could do this. And they weren't overwhelmed with it. In fact, we saw students going back and changing previous answers as they went through because all of those items relate to each other. And I saw two different times students get to an item and go, wait a minute, like I answered something wrong previously because this doesn't make sense now. Or I realized that my previous answer had to be incorrect because now I just got a little bit more information within the cluster itself. So having those items all on one page makes it really easy for students to go back and check, how did I answer this previously? Or change it if they need to versus items on separate pages because they're much less likely to select back on pages and change answers than when it's all there.
Yeah, and
For
so
your
that process, sorry, I was gonna just, sorry, you want to finish really quick?
um yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so that process, they're called cognitive labs, or sometimes you might hear them called cog labs. And so we did this for with three different districts that were pretty representative of our population of Utah. And again, we did this at all grade levels, and overwhelmingly, the response was students actually preferred the clusters. And they felt like they had more freedom too. They didn't feel like they were being told, you have to analyze this character and answer questions about this character. They loved that, hey, I related more to this character and what I read, and so I'm going to go with this character. Um, so they did feel like it was much more scaffolded. Although they didn't use that language, they were just like, I just feel like I'm doing better because I have so much more information and I'm sticking to the same thing for a while here, you know? So, but the third graders, the fourth graders that we did this with right at the beginning of the school year in September, they definitely felt like they could perform better now. About your good thinking of what are some good ways to prepare students for clusters first, and then what are some ideas of things that we could use in our own classrooms um, as well. So we would love to invite anyone to put something in the chat or probably come off of mute to share your good thinking. So we'll give time for people to put something in the chat. And if you would like to come off of mute, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll invite those of you that do to come off of mute. And by raise your hand, you can do the react option. And normally, I believe in a react, you should have the option to raise your hand. It might be in the more as well if you're not seeing that. I like it. We learn by doing. Jump on in. Get them in those training tests. Oh, and I love that. Yes, Megan. Make sure those students know that it's okay if you don't have a right answer because you get to just choose who you want to analyze. So if it says just choose one, choose one, then really just choose one. It's up to you. There's no right or wrong character to analyze. Love that. What other good thoughts do we have? Sounds like some districts are using performance matters assessments, which might possibly mirror a lot of what we've been talking about in the clusters. Um, Using the math benchmarks multiple times a week, so they're getting the practice and exposure to the format. Have them take the practice test and discuss it. Yeah, the practice tests are not secure in any way, shape, or format. You can project that puppy up on your screen and you can walk through it and discuss it um, and play around with all the tools and everything. Yes, modeling for our students. How do you choose your own adventure? Pair assessment looks like for a similar format. Do the training tests have an answer key somewhere? Um, we used to post the answer keys, but we stopped posting the answer keys because we really don't want the focus on the practice tests to be the content. Um, and we know there's always gonna, we we can provide it if you really, really want it. I would just say reach out to us. In most cases, the answers are hopefully pretty obvious. But if not, you can reach out to us. The purpose, we took them down because really people started getting really wrapped up in the content, and it's not a content test, it's a practice test for the platform and all the tools and the item types.
And can I add that there's also, I don't know if the ELA clusters do this, but the science clusters do provide a scoring assertion in the training test so that you can kind of mess with the answers and see how the system is scoring the cluster while you are working on it.
I don't think the ELA one does that currently, but that's
Mhm.
something we can definitely talk about.
Mhm. Yes. So can we take the practice test together as a class? Yes. Practice tests are not secure. Hannah, we were told that students had to take the RISE benchmark before we could go over it with them. Can we do it as the same time as them, or do we need to take it first? Yeah, you do need to. Benchmarks are kind of open secure. So once students take it, then you can discuss things as a class, but you should not be taking screenshots or be printing it out and sending it home and all that kind of stuff. You can sit with your students and say, let's talk about this. This is how you answered those items on the test, and really allow that benchmark to inform instruction. But benchmarks are still considered secure. So there does need to be an air of security. And again, inquire within your own LEA, your own district, your own charter to understand what is the policy when it comes to benchmarks, because some districts do require the benchmarks.
And I'll jump in here too. When Megan said that you could take the test alongside your students and project it, she was referring to the training test, not the benchmark test, because those are two different types of tests in the RISE portal.
The training test you can just jump on without a user ID. You can just use that guest login. Benchmarks do have to be logged into the secure platform. All right. Anyone willing to come off a mute this Friday afternoon? Feel like I'm begging. Here's Megan begging again for more help. And if not, I won't force it.
I'm coming off mute for you.
Oh, love
Only,
it. Thank you.
only because you got a 3-day weekend coming up, so you deserve something. No, I shared with my group that with students, whenever we did our first practice test, which I firmly believe is like really the place to start. I always prefaced it as we were gonna sandbox it, and their job was to be Buddy the elf in the elevator, right? And push all the buttons that they could and play and explore, and they laughed. And then they kind of moved into that with kind of a fun mindset versus, oh gosh, we're testing something. And then they also got the chance to explain about the tools, what worked, what didn't, and they taught each other. And so it kind of set off the platform in a way that didn't feel so testy per se, and it just felt a little more light for them. So I usually had good success kind of starting in that regard. So
Oh boy, you made my 5-year-old very happy with your Buddy the Elf reference there. She would love that approach to testing. I love that idea. Press all the buttons. Oh my gosh, that sounds like a nightmare in some buildings.
well, it gets it out of their system, right? And that was my whole thing, is find out what each tool does, and then you get to talk through scenarios, what works, what doesn't, right? And then when you go into benchmarks or anything else, they already know what everything does. Then you're into the meat of it versus them needing to get that out of their system. And I just found it to be effective, at least for me. So
Yeah. Yeah, that also makes me think like maybe offer like a scavenger hunt, do a scavenger hunt. How do you find the dictionary tool? Um, how do you expand, the passage? How do you expand the item, right? How do you zoom in? All those things. I love that. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Yep, the more they're exposed to, the better. All right, so let's get into We have about 25 minutes left, so we want to get into the other resources, and then we'll briefly go over the Utah Aspire Plus changes as well. Um, so hopefully with the group that we're with today, this is no big surprise as these were rolled out last year, but if it is new for you, surprise, the Utah State Core ELA standards have been revised. So the 2023 pre-K-12 ELA standards were introduced last year. They were expected to start to be taught last year, and they should continue to be taught until they are revised again. It is state law. This is a law that the legislatures have set that our standards need to be reviewed with the option to revise them every 10 years, and that happens for all content areas. So there is a link on this slide to the new standards. The major changes is that the reading strands, the literary and informational reading strands were combined, as many of those were very similar skills for reading. There is a new grade 3 standard. And then for grade 7, one of the biggest shifts was for just grade 7, they used to compare literary to informational, but now they are only comparing literary to literary and informational to informational. So that was one big change with our standards. And then there's more of a focus on speaking now, as all the speaking and listening standards do require the production of speaking and somehow, and that is why those were removed from the assessment, because we do not have, while speaking is something that can be assessed on assessments, we even do that with our WIDA screener and WIDA access tests. It is part of our rule that we have automated scoring, and part of our contracts that we have automated scoring, and we do not have a way to have speaking automatically scored. We're sure some kind of great AI is being developed, but right now speaking still does have to be hand scored by humans. So speaking had to be removed because of that speaking production component of all the standards now. And then the language standards had largely all been moved over into the writing standards. And again, per board rule, the state elected board has said that writing will only be assessed in 5th and 8th grade. We get a lot of feedback from a lot of people on that. We do not get to make that decision. It is the board that makes that decision. So we would always encourage you, if you have thoughts of support or thoughts of suggestions, we would say contact your local, your board representative on that. So the standards are available, they're out there. Hopefully not a surprise. Another resource that is available is our core guides. These core guides, do note they are somewhat living documents, so they are going to be updated over time. There is a link to the elementary core guides on this slide and a link to the secondary core guides, but essentially you will see a core guide for each grade. And then it'll look at every standard now for ELA. So you'll have the standard listed in the core guide and what are the concepts and skills that need to be mastered in order to be able to say the student has this full standard mastered. What kind of critical background knowledge and schema do those students need as they come in to this standard? What are standards that are related to this one that can be taught in tandem and together to support that standard? What academic language will we use on the RISE assessment related to that standard? And please always remember that we will always use the language of the standard. Okay, so if the standard says main idea, we're going to use the word main idea on the assessment. Okay. We see a lot of times teachers want to take the standards and put them in more student-friendly terms. And so they take some of that academic language and they'll use a synonym. And when the students get to the test, they're not used to that term and they may not know what it means. So we would really highly encourage all of our educators to use the language of the standards and provide the scaffolds necessary for the students to access that academic language presented in the standards. And then there are some assessment exemplars on ways that you can formatively assess those standards in your class. Like we said, these are living documents. We are constantly getting feedback on them and how we can improve them. They were created by Utah educators for Utah educators, but as is anything, it can always be improved. And so we're always looking for good feedback, and do note that they are living documents that will be updated from time to time to better support our ELA teachers the more we get into the teaching and assessing of these revised standards. For the sake of time, we were going to have you guys look at these, but due to time, we're not going to have you guys jump into breakout rooms quite yet. We are going to give you time to look at the core guides and the performance level descriptors in just a second here. So moving on to our next slide, there are new updated RISE PLDs, performance level descriptors. And so this takes the standards that are assessed in RISE, and it says, what does a student performing at a level 1 look like for this standard? What does a student performing at a level 2 look like for this standard, a 3 or a 4, as those are the different proficiency levels that students are going to be given once they're finally scored. These performance level descriptors will play a very large role as well when it comes to the standard setting because, and again, these were done by Utah educators, these PLDs, and it really will help us understand and determine what those cuts are going to be for a student performing at a level 1 for each standard, for a student performing at a level 2 for each standard. So, these are really helpful when you are planning instruction, okay, and ensuring that, am I teaching this standard am I getting eventually to that mastery level, right? And also assessing what skill level the student is at, as they are, as you're assessing that standard with them. So we would like to give you some time to access both, and it's going to be up to you, the core guides or the PLDs. And the PLDs are on the RISE portal, and here are the directions on how to access this. But we wanted to give you now, we're not going to force you into breakout rooms, but we would like to give you about 5 minutes of individual work time. And review time to go in and look at either the PLDs or the core guides to get used to them. And we want to have you start to think to yourself, how can this inform, whether it's the core guide or the PLD, my instruction and my planning when it comes to teaching the language arts standards? So we're going to go ahead and give you 5 minutes. And again, Teresa has some ideas in the chat of how you can use these resources. So again, I will ask if anyone would love to come off of mute and share your thoughts, if you had any aha moments, or how you think you could best utilize these to support your instruction and your students, or go ahead and share that in the chat.
I'm kind of struck with the thought that you've got to have a good understanding of like the PLDs in your own mind. Otherwise, how can you get them to the next level?
Yeah, it really does inform like what do I need to do to get them to this next step? What supports do I need to put in place? What are the implications for the instruction in my classroom, right? Yeah, it really does turn into my students can do this. So how do I get them to now do that? what next step in my process, right? I love that. Thank
there
you,
any
thank
plans
you.
to, is there any plans to um, include resources and ideas for like how to move strategically from one, um, like from a one to a two, two to a three, three to a four?
So that would be the charge of our teaching and learning department of that instructional component. That is a fantastic question. We are currently working on a state literacy plan right now. But I would say if you want help in, hey, we have these PLDs and how can we design some instruction and what are the implications, and what are some real things that our educators can do when we see a student performing at this one level on this standard, and how do we move them to the two, and then how do we move them to the three? We can take that back to our teaching and learning team, and then see what they can come up with. But I love that suggestion. That is fantastic. How many questions will there be on each cluster benchmark? That it's different. Most benchmarks, or sorry, clusters, whether it's summative or benchmark, they're going to have 5 to 7 parts, and each part could potentially have 1 to 3 different interactions within it. I would say total amount of interactions, it's normally going to cap out at like 11 or 12. How many cluster benchmarks will be there per grade? That it's going to be a little different per grade on the summative test. Every student will see one cluster on the summative. I want to say 3 to 4 benchmarks for cluster benchmarks should become available. And they will be added to the existing benchmark bank. They will not be replacing anything. All right, great questions. I'm going to have Teresa move to our next section because we only have 7 minutes and we want to honor your time, and you guys have already started asking questions. This slide will appear at the very end again. For those of you that only go through 8th, you are welcome to jump off. But for those of you that are like, I want to know what's coming for 9 and 10, we are going to get into that. Teresa did just post a link to a survey form, and that survey form does need to be completed in order for you all to receive credit and relicensure points in Midas. So if you are going to jump off, make sure that you capture that link in the chat. But we are going to move on to Utah Aspire Plus changes for 9th and 10th. So with that, we should be pretty quick here. The biggest things for everyone to know is what's changed. And I cannot tell you how many rumors we have heard about the Utah Aspire Plus test. I can't even keep up anymore, but I promise you, this slide has the full truth. Okay, so if y'all need to take a screenshot and share this and blast this from the mountaintops, please help us with this. What has changed? The English subtest, the Utah Aspire Plus test, consisted of a math, a science, a reading, and an English test. Okay, 4 tests to make up the entire Utah Aspire Plus test. The English test was retired. Students this year will not see the English test. This reduces the overall testing time of all the 4 tests by 45 minutes, because that's how long that English test was. So less testing, 1 less test for the students to take for Utah Aspire Plus. So as a result of that English test being removed, there will be no English proficiency score reported, and there will no longer be a standalone predicted ACT score for English. Okay. We also cannot report a composite ELA score. That was when we combined reading and English to get a composite score. Okay. Why did we remove this test? again, due to the revision of the standards and seeing that most of the language standards now exist in our writing standards. Again, we can only assess writing in grades 5 and 8 summatively, so we didn't have an option. Without being able to have students produce writing, we had to retire the English subtest. But what has remained the same? Well, you're still going to get a scale score for reading, a proficiency score for reading, because the reading test is staying the same. You will still get an ACT predicted score for reading, and you will still get an overall ACT composite predicted score. Okay, some people are asking, how can you do that without having that English subtest now? How can you predict how they're going to do on ACT overall? We are still collecting a ton of data from the students doing the 3 other tests, and there are a lot of correlative data that we can gather from the reading test to tell us how the students could potentially do. We will have more information about the validity and reliability of that reporting for teachers very soon. The reading testing time has also stayed the same. That reading subtest is still a timed test at 75 minutes. All right, next slide. Because the reading test has stayed largely the same for our Utah Aspire Plus 9 and 10, scores are not going to be delayed. Okay, so this is different from RISE. We are happy to say UA plus reading scores are not going to be delayed. You should be able to receive those scores within 24 hours of the students taking the test. UA Plus's PLDs largely stayed the same as well. Again, they have been updated some. We have the link again for the RISE PLDs here on the slide. And again, we have the link to the practice tests. We're going to encourage everything that we said about RISE, the same here. Get those students practicing the tests, get them used to the format, and especially the big change of having it be timed. How do they really have time management skills when testing? Okay. And again, how can the PLDs inform your instruction? Okay. On the next slide, we have the updated blueprint. Again, it is largely the same. The only thing that changed just slightly, and we're talking by a percent, is the passage distribution, where it's just a little heavier and informational. But really largely, I mean, we're talking like it changed by a percent. So you can go to the reading blueprints here. You, again, linked on this page to see what the test is going to be. Again, we let you know there are 35 operational items and 10 field test items. Those field test items come in any spot on the test, but it is a fixed form test. It's not adaptive. So again, 45 total items. 35 that are operational, that they are assessed summatively on, 10 again for our field testing of new items, since we are constantly developing our bank, and the 75 minutes to complete that in. So those are the big changes to Utah Aspire Plus. And with that, we have 1 minute to open it up for questions. If anyone would like to stay on, we would like to thank you for being here with us this Friday afternoon. This again is going to be posted to our assessment YouTube page, and we have provided our email addresses. We normally are relegated to only being able to communicate with your LEAs, and they are tasked with having to disperse that information out to you all because of local control laws and our communication guidelines. But if you reach out to us, those floodgates open and we're able to answer anything for you all. And we give our email addresses and not our phone numbers, because most of the time we are in meetings and trainings like this, and it's hard for us to get to our phones. So it's a little easier for us to sneak a peek at our email. We will stay on for questions. And we thank you all for being with us this Friday afternoon. We hope